YouTube. I'm making this video because yesterday while checking out Google Trends, I saw that the topic eugenics was trending. I found that shocking in the year 2025. And I would like to make this video just to refute some of the notions of the modern eugenicist belief. So, if you don't know, eugenics is the idea that there's good genes. That's what eugenics means. Good genes, eugenics. And it's most heavily associated in the 19th and 20th century with some really vicious forms of racism that really did lead to the terrorism that swept through the southern United States, targeting black people, and the Nazi movement in Germany in the early 20th century. Eugenics was a very potent idea that many people all across Europe and the United States believed in, who weren't all Nazis, but it helped prop up Nazi and racialist ideologies that were extremely violent and awful and genocidal. But after, in about the mid-20th century, eugenics as an idea really lost support in the mainstream. It was a very popular mainstream idea for decades and decades, but the association with the Nazis and with the Southern racists really, destroyed its reputation, and people in polite society stopped spreading eugenicist beliefs. However, like all bad things, it doesn't die just as easily as that. And so there's a modern sort of techno-futurist twist to the whole eugenicist thing. You can see it sort of crop up, maybe not so blatantly, but it comes up in the philosophies of the post-humanist type tech bro movements. And again, it's this idea that there are good genes that we want to select for, and there are bad genes that we want out of the gene pool. Well, this really begs into question what the role of genes are in natural human selection, right? And with the technology that we've developed since the 90s and 2000s, we understand that say the BRCA gene, a mutation on the BRCA gene, does lead to it leads to the likelihood of developing breast cancer as an adult, this mutation on the gene. And so it is something that we human beings can look for and select for and say, hey, we know that there's a higher likelihood that the BRCA gene with this mutation can lead to cancer later in life. So if we could, if we can spot the mutation, maybe we can take it out of the gene pool and it won't do that. However, genes still don't work just as easily as that, right? They're more like little switches, and yes, mutations in them can be bad, but perhaps you've heard of sickle cell disease. Perhaps you suffer from sickle cell disease. Maybe you've heard that sickle cell disease affects African Americans more disproportionately than it does any other population in the United States. Well, it's because sickle cell disease is linked to a genetic variation in people of West African descent, that the genetic variation gave their bodies a much stronger immune response to a variation of malaria. I think there are 4 main strains of malaria, and it gave human beings who lived in West Africa for the last tens of thousands of years, it gave their bodies a much stronger response to that malaria, so it wasn't killing them. So it was selecting for this genetic mutation, right? The strength of the society, the good gene in this instance, the good gene was giving people this, not an immunity, but an ability to fight off this malaria and not die and not get repeatedly sick over and over from it. So that's a good gene, right? But over time, because of genetic bottlenecking, it also just happens to lead to this mutation in the hemoglobin in a person, which leads to extremely painful conditions throughout life, and it leads to early death. So is it a good gene or is it a bad gene, right? Is it eugenic or malgenic? It's not as simple as that, right? The genes switch on and off certain traits depending on certain biological pressures, certain environmental pressures, like exogenous pressures like the malarial virus, right? But the malarial virus will also adapt to our adaptations, right? It's a constant flux, right? So there's no point at which nature achieves perfection, right? Because it's constantly shifting, adapting, and changing. All the organisms on Earth have some sort of homeostasis that they're trying to achieve, some at the expense of others, right? Malaria at the expense of its host, of human beings. But we, in response to that adaptation to us as a host for them, learn how to defend ourselves from that because it kills us, and it's not good for us as a biological entity. So are there things called good genes and bad genes? No, there's good information and bad information, but it's not just that. If eugenics were a theory founded in scientific reality, then necessarily it would imply that inbreeding and incest were the biologically optimal ways of reproducing, which we know is not true at all. We know that inbreeding and incest actually leads to a far higher likelihood that individuals will inherit genetic mutations that expose them to greater risks of death and disease. So if there really were good genes that were trying to funnel into the genetic gene pool and push out other genes along the way, then naturally it would be the closest relatives to each other reproducing with each other that would siphon down that genetic inheritance. But again, we human beings know from lots of lived experience, billions of human beings in societies of different configurations, sometimes relying on very close incestuous relationships to reproduce. We know that is a biological dead end, right? And so genetic diversity strengthens every human being, right? But we're also not so diverse from one another that we should celebrate one person's difference from another's, right? Because human beings share 3 billion base pairs of DNA that are identical, right? The only difference is it's about 3 million genetic base pairs between any two random individuals that make up the difference between you and me, right? And 3 million may sound like a lot, but that is 0.1% of 3 billion. So that means that you and I are 99.9% genetically identical, right? And so if that genetic diversity is such a small little band, we don't really want to be kicking out anything. We want to actually let that diversity get mixed up more and more throughout the generations, because those are opportunities to adapt to different needs that we don't necessarily know what those needs are right now today.